Hello, everyone. We're going to read Chapter 13 of Operation Redwood today. Buckle up. Robin looked at Julian. Who's Daphne Carter? My aunt, Julian said miserably, Sibley's wife. My dad is going to kill me. Robin's face looked strangely blank. What does Danny mean? The tide is rising. What tide? That was just his code for an emergency. If Daphne called the sheriff, Danny must have told them I'm here. He took a deep breath. The sheriff's on his way here to talk to your dad. His mind felt like the inside of a freezer. What are we going to do? Well, why would Danny tell, though? I don't know. Daphne probably tortured him. Well, don't just stand there. Call him, quick, before my parents walk in. Julian picked up the phone and quickly dialed Danny's number. He listened for a moment, then hung up. It's the machine. Robin started pacing up and down the floor. We can't stop the sheriff from coming. He's already on his way. Call your aunt. There is nothing in the world Julian would rather do less than call his aunt. He would rather eat grubs. He would rather run to the Greyhound station and take the first bus that came along. What would I tell her? Robin's eyes opened wide. Well, for starters, you could tell her my dad didn't kidnap you. He took another deep breath. You're right. I should call her. He dialed her home phone quickly before he lost his nerve. He would think of what to say when she answered. He heard his uncle's voice on the answering machine and hung up with relief. Doesn't she have a cell phone? Robin asked. Of course she had a cell phone. The problem with the cell phone was she'd probably answer it. It was better not to think. He'd started slowly punching in her cell phone number when he heard the sound of a car coming up the driveway. Robin looked out the window. It's the sheriff's car. Julian felt like he was going to faint. He had the sickening feeling that all the trouble he'd ever been in before was just a drop compared to the ocean of trouble ahead. Come on, Robin said urgently. Julian just stood watching the patrol car pull up next to Bob's white truck. Julian, hurry! He followed Robin onto the back deck and down the stairs. There, she turned sharply to the right and pulled aside a wooden lattice. It's kind of like a fence or something. A lattice is kind of like that crossed pattern of wooden fence that you see sometimes in backyards. They crawled under the deck. Then Robin carefully slid the lattice back into place. The crawl space was dark and musty and filled with old leaves. He could barely see Robin as she crawled up the uneven slope toward the front of the house. He tried to scramble after her without putting any pressure on his sore left knee. As he moved awkwardly forward, he felt the sticky, elastic tangle of a spider web paste itself to his mouth. He sat up to brush it away and hit his head against the cement foundation so hard the pain seemed to ring through his whole body. When the pain had dimmed, he bent down again and slowly crawled next to Robin. She was looking out of a lattice that Julian figured must be just to the left of the front door. A beefy man in a uniform was standing next to the patrol car, wiping his sunglasses with a handkerchief. Hey, Ralph, they heard Bob say. Good afternoon, Ralph replied, squinting and holding up his sunglasses for inspection. What brings you out here? Did Martha give you the green light to our little fishing expedition? I guess you didn't get my message, Ralph said. Ralph put his sunglasses back on and glanced in the side mirror of the car. Something wrong? Well, you might say that. We seem to have a little situation here. I spent a good 15 minutes on the phone this morning with a woman named Daphne Carter. Ring any bells? No, I don't think so. Why don't you get out of the sun? They both stepped into view under the shade of the oak trees. Any relation to Sibley Carter? Now that you mention it, she happens to be his wife. Is there some trouble next door? Bob asked, looking worried. She seems to think you're in some trouble. Said you kidnapped her nephew. Ralph crossed his thick arms. The corners of his mouth were tight. Kidnapped her nephew? What in the world? Bob's face was a picture of amazement. Ralph gave a low chuckle. It was worth coming out here just to see the look on your face. What? Is she crazy? I don't know, Ralph said, still chuckling and shaking his head. She's a piece of work. Misplaced her nephew. Must have run away. I would too if she was my aunt. But why would she think I have anything to do with it? Said she had information you'd lured him up here. I couldn't get it straight. Something about Robin, too. The kid's name is Julian. Julian? Bob's face crumpled. He put his hand to his forehead and closed his eyes for a moment. Wait a minute, Ralph said, his smile fading. You actually know this kid? Julian felt his fingers and toes go numb. I was afraid of something like this. What's going on, Bob? Almost 2 weeks ago at lunch, Robin says she invited a new exchange student up here from San Francisco. Says they were pen pals. Name's Julian Lee. Chinese, or half Chinese, I guess. Good looking kid. I picked him up from the Greyhound. Bob shook his head a little ruefully. I knew something wasn't right. He didn't mention the Carters? Not a word. Says his mom's out of town. I left a message. Nancy wanted to keep him. He's been here ever since. So how in the world did this kid get hooked up with Robin? I have no idea. Well, I guess it's a good thing I dropped by, Ralph said, shaking his head. I'd better let Miss Carter know we found the boy. He lumbered over to the car and disappeared inside. Julian's foot had fallen asleep, and his throat itched. He tried to swallow softly to keep from coughing. He glanced at Robin, and she made a silent grimace, but stayed perfectly still. Bob was less than 10 feet away. Julian tried to read his expression. He didn't look furious, but it was like a dark shadow had passed over his face. After an almost unbearable amount of time, Ralph got out of the patrol car. Well, Bob, seems like you're going to have the pleasure of meeting Miss Daphne Carter yourself. How's that? Apparently, she couldn't wait for the sheriff's office to clear this up. She's on her way here. She called the office about an hour ago. Ralph, I'm sorry about all this, Bob said. I had a feeling that boy wasn't telling me the whole story. That boy. Julian thought of the hours he had spent with Bob in the workshop, in the garden, at the table. That Julian, it seemed, no longer existed. He was a stranger again, just some kid off a bus who'd conned Bob into letting him stay. Why don't you come inside for now, Bob said to the sheriff. Just as their feet banged overhead, a low rumbling began in the distance. The two sets of footsteps stopped, then headed back outside. Julian could see Ralph putting on his sunglasses and staring down the driveway. Looks like you've got company, Bob, he said. Daphne's silver SUV rattled up in front of the house in a cloud of dust. Julian took advantage of the noise to shift his position slightly and scratch his nose. Robin started furiously brushing something off her legs. When the engine noise died, they froze again. Julian immediately wished he'd straightened out his legs more. They were already cramping up. Out of the SUV stepped a man wearing a pink knit shirt and tennis shorts. He looked vigorous and, at the same time, harmless. He loped around to the passenger side and opened the door. Daphne emerged, sporting a pair of cropped black pants and a sleeveless blouse. Thank you, Sergei, she said with a pointed politeness. Miss Daphne Carter, I presume? Said Ralph, stepping toward her. Who are you, the sheriff? Deputy Sheriff. We chatted on the phone this morning. Ralph O'Brien. Daphne ignored his extended hand. Where's my nephew? She demanded. Ralph turned toward Bob. I'm sure he's in the house or running around somewhere with my daughter, Bob said. Do you mean to tell me you haven't even located him yet? Daphne asked. This is an outrage. This is unbelievable. Well, Ralph said slowly, if Bob says your nephew's here, I'm sure he is. She gave him her coldest stare. You don't take me seriously, do you? Well, let me tell you something. I'm thinking of pressing charges. My nephew has been missing for almost 2 weeks. Apparently, he was lured up over the internet by this Bob Elder. She turned to Bob. That's you, I presume. And when I report this crime, does the sheriff's office even lift a finger to help me? Daphne paused, finger in the air. No! If it hadn't been for the directory assistants and Sergei here, she said, giving him a proprietary glance, I'd never have found Julian. Sergei gave a little wave and an apologetic smile. Now, ma'am, I can see you're upset, said Ralph. Don't you now, ma'am, me, Daphne said. My entire day has been ruined. I wasted almost 4 hours driving up here. I had to cancel all my appointments. One of them took me 2 months to get. If you don't produce Julian this instant, she paused, I'm calling the CIA and the FBI. You'll regret the day you condescended to me. I believe there's been a misunderstanding, said Ralph in a placating tone. But why don't we get Julian? Maybe that'll help straighten everything out. What do you think, Bob? Bob stood up with, sorry. Bob stood still with his arms crossed. Julian remembered that look. It was the same way Bob had watched him when they'd first met in the parking lot. Maybe you can clear something up for me. Julian informed me that his mother is out of the country. Is that correct? His mother, Daphne rolled her eyes. She goes off for the entire summer without making any arrangements for Julian. No lessons, no camps. I had to set up everything. At our expense, I might add. Then, when I call to find out about sending Julian a little package I'd prepared for him, the camp says he never showed up. I nearly had a heart attack. You thought he was at camp? Bob asked. Listen, she snapped. The tuition was paid in full. His duffel bag was packed. Daphne stopped herself. I don't have to defend myself to you. She turned to Ralph with a look of astonishment on her face. Why am I the one being interrogated here? Well, of course, we have to ensure that you actually are Julian's legal guardian before we turn him over to you, Ralph said calmly. You have to ensure what? Daphne suddenly lowered her voice. I lived with the boy under my roof for 9 weeks. 9 weeks! She stood there with her mouth open for a moment, suddenly at a loss for words. I gave him a room, fed him, she said, picking up steam, supervised his homework, even threw parties for him. If I'm not in charge of him, nobody is. Bob studied her for another long moment. Then he said, I'll go fetch him. Julian could hear the heavy thump of his footsteps above them, and then the ringing of the dinner bell. Robin started sliding down the slope. Julian followed close behind. Somehow he seemed to be making a lot more noise than she was. His feet had fallen asleep, and he felt like he was moving on stumps. He wiggled his toes, trying to make the pins and needles feeling go away. Do we have to come out? He whispered. The cobwebby crawl space was starting to seem like the perfect place to spend the afternoon. Obviously. We can't stay under here forever, she whispered back. Those ants are making me crazy. They were crawling all over me. When the sound of the bell had died away, they heard Bob's footsteps as he crossed back to the front of the house, and they emerged slowly from underneath the deck. Robin replaced the lattice and gave Julian a critical look. You're a mess, she said. Julian wiped his face on a t-shirt, which only served to cover it with grime. The white bandana around his knee was now filthy and spotted red with blood. Robin looked clean and composed, as always. They walked slowly to the front of the house, where Bob and Ralph were speaking together in muted tones. Julian braced himself as Daphne directed her furious gaze toward him. Julian, I could kill you, she said. Your uncle's going to have something to say when we get back. There are going to be serious consequences. Julian's knee was still throbbing with pain. When I called High Sights Academy to send you a little package I'd prepared, Daphne continued, do you know what they told me? She came to a halt, eyebrows raised. They said you were on an African safari. The outraged look on Daphne's face, coupled with the memory of Danny chatting about wildebeests, was too much for Julian. His shoulders started shaking with laughter. He tried to maintain a solemn expression, but the more horrified Daphne looked, the less Julian was able to control himself. Finally, Daphne stood gaping and shrieked, do you think this is funny? Because let me tell you, the humor is lost on me. I nearly killed myself trying to track you down. What in the world is going on here? At the sound of Nancy's voice, Julian sobered up instantly. He turned and saw Nancy with Jojo in her arms. Molly was at her side, her face paler than ever. Julian's aunt is here to take him home. Daphne Carter. Sibley Carter's wife. Bob's eyes signaled with a kind of warning. Julian, do you have anything to say? Julian looked uncertainly around him. He wasn't sure what Bob was asking him for. An apology? His opinion about returning home? An explanation for why his aunt was here, ranting and raving? He decided that an apology would be the safest route, and he was truly, deeply sorry now that he saw himself through their eyes, an impostor, an outlaw, taking advantage of their kindness and trust. I'm really sorry, Bob. Julian kept his eyes down. And Nancy, he added, turning to where Nancy was standing. You stood there and told us you weren't running away, Bob said. All the warmth had drained from his face. I wasn't running away, really. Everything was so complicated. Better to say as little as possible. I guess I should have told you my aunt and uncle where. I guess I should have told my aunt and uncle where I was going, he continued half-heartedly. Perhaps he has the bags? Sergei said helpfully. Go inside and get your stuff, Daphne directed. And clean yourself up, she shouted as Julian turned and headed inside. I don't want those filthy clothes inside my car. Before the front door closed, Robin slipped inside after him. They climbed silently to the loft. Then Robin said, I tried to think of something to say to help, but I couldn't. What could you say? It was a nightmare. Julian threw his clothes into his duffel bag. I guess Operation Redwood is over. Maybe a way will open, Robin said doubtfully. Maybe. I better get out of these clothes, he said, and she left. A moment later, he saw the tips of her fingers push a large band-aid up from the loft steps. The voices outside were growing louder. Julian could hear his aunt's high, demanding tone and Nancy's voice, low and urgent. Then Jojo started wailing. He's probably tired, Julian thought. It's time for his nap. Wouldn't talk that way to a dog, he heard Nancy saying when he stepped outside again. The voices stopped. Bob had moved over to stand next to Nancy and the children. Nancy and Daphne were glaring at each other, and Ralph was standing between them with his arms apart like a referee. I'm ready, Julian said softly. Without saying a word, Daphne turned, climbed into the SUV, and slammed the door. Julian walked over to where the elder families had gathered. Goodbye, he said. Jojo took his thumb out of his mouth and said, I don't want Julian to say goodbye. Julian could barely lift his eyes to meet Nancy's. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everything. She gave him a hug with her free arm. You take care, she said. If you need, she began, but Bob put a cautionary hand on her shoulder. Thank you for all your help with Jojo, was all she said in the end. Glancing at Ralph, Julian said again, Sorry for the trouble. He looked last at Robin, standing barefoot on the front steps. She waved and looked like she was about to cry. Sergei took his duffel bag and put it in the trunk. Off we go, he said cheerfully. Julian climbed into the back seat. The car spun around and started down the long driveway, and Julian watched Robin and her family recede through the tinted glass of the rear window.